Hello there, and welcome to this first episode of Money Meets Mission. This is a new series of conversations brought to you by AVPN in association with Tech for Impact Asia. In these conversations, we're going to be exploring the links and the spaces between the worlds of finance, investment, philanthropy, the environment, and social impact. I'll be talking to leaders from across the spectrum of business, philanthropy, and impact investing to explore how they are putting their resources to work tackling some of the largest and most complex social and environmental issues facing Asia. And today, my guests on this first episode are Alan Hsu and Dr. Philip Duffy. Gentlemen, welcome, and many thanks for joining me in this conversation.
Happy to be
thanks
here.
For having me.
Thank you for having us.
So Alan is the managing director at the investment advisory firm Wellington Management, where he conducts fundamental financial analysis and research on utilities and the renewable energy and clean technology sectors. Phil is president and executive director of the Woodwell Climate Research Center, and he was a former senior advisor in the Obama White House, and he's very engaged in multiple aspects of the US climate policy. Now, you can find their full and detailed bios and descriptions of the activities of Woodwell and Wellington on the AVPN Money Meets Mission page and at Tech for Impact. So I'm not going to go into great detail about all the great work that they and their companies do right now, because our aim today, gentlemen, is to discuss the big issues and to benefit, if we can, from your individual expertise and from the collaboration between your firms. And I think that's probably a decent place to begin this conversation. And Alan, I'll kick it off with you. As an investment advisory firm living in the world of high finance, where quarterly results are really one of the driving factors of what you do, where financial return is the key motivation for most of the companies in your business, just explain to me a little bit about why we're here, what you're doing with Woodwell, and the connection between the investment world that you live in and the environmental topics that are now dominating global conversation.
Yes, Taymor, as I previously stated, thank you very much for having us. It really is an interesting time. And I do think that the singular reason that has brought us to this point, or me here today, really relates to this idea that climate or sustainability broadly are mispriced risks. And I think that it's really taken the investment community a very long time to recognize that sustainability, climate, carbon, etc., however you wish to conceptualize it, has really gone from a thematic, feel-good idea, invest because it's a credential or some form of virtue signaling, to, in fact, this is a systematic risk. Whether you define climate as a physical risk, a transition risk, or merely a reporting risk, it is a factor of sorts, a beta of sorts, that impacts companies and sectors across all types of asset classes. And as a result, it represents something that is effectively systematic. And it is a real risk because you can see how it's beginning to impair the ability for companies to grow. It impacts the existing asset values. It will influence how they invest. It will influence how we view certain business models, what is viable, what is attractive for our economies and societies writ large. So this idea of climate being mispriced and actually representing a risk factor more than just a thematic opportunity or a thematic feel-good mantra is really what fascinates me most today.
All right, so there is a very real and immediate financial value in looking at climate issues in the context of investment. Is there more to it than that? In engaging with Philip and his work and with the overall topics at hand, are you also beginning to come around to thinking about the social impact of the kind of investing that you do, the broader issues, and influencing the entire debate from a practical perspective?
Yes, say more so. That follow-up question reminds me that I didn't really fully answer your first question. So the collaboration with Woodwell really began several years ago, but it's a relationship we formalized at the end of 2018. And the very simple idea is to marry climate science and climate research with investment outcomes, because it was the foresight of some of our firm's leadership many years ago that increasingly climate science, climate modeling, a discrete understanding of climate risk specifically was going to be a differentiated source or driver for returns and investment outcomes in institutional portfolios, and that this would happen at scale. And so being able to better understand and to bring to bear a differentiated way to apply research is what led to this collaboration. So we have biweekly dialogue between Woodwell research scientists and Wellington investors to better understand how their insights might impact investment returns.
Okay.
To your last question, the residual of that can be better social benefit. So if you, for example, simplistically can solve for things like climate, think about the benefit you may have for improvements in air quality, for perhaps in some cases solving for or alleviating the pressure or the problem around water scarcity, or addressing things like climate-related migration. We find that there are social benefits, but they stem from addressing what we perceive to be a systematic risk.
All right, great. Thanks for that, Alan. Phil, what about from your perspective?
Well, for a couple of things. I mean, I think from my perspective, first of all, the work with the investment community is based on something pretty fundamental, which is the idea that human well-being and indeed prosperity depends on the natural world, and that we're all more connected and more dependent on the natural world than we sometimes realize, and in particular. A really foundational idea is that a rapidly changing climate presents risks. And one of the things that I've really recognized over the years of looking at how changes in climate affect different societal sectors is just that, is that human systems, everything, our infrastructure, the way we manage natural resources, water, and so forth, all of it is very, very finely adapted to a certain climate, whatever it is. And it's not to say that, the present climate isn't optimal, and certainly in many parts of the world, it's not optimal. But we've learned to live with it. And if it's changing very rapidly, then we have to rethink all kinds of fundamental things. How do we build buildings? How do we protect ourselves? How do we, as I said, how do we grow food and make sure we have enough food? And how do we manage water resources?
But Phil, let me interrupt you for a second. I mean, I kind of, from the scientific perspective, obviously all of that makes perfect sense. But as I said at the introduction of the show, I mean, one of the things that we're really trying to do, and I think much of the planet is trying to do, is to interconnect all those different variances and variables that you talked about and more. And one of which is, how does finance and climate interact? How do we bring together those two elements and look for the spaces and the overlaps between them to make sense in order to impact and bring us to the goals that we're trying to achieve? From your perspective as a scientist, do you think that engaging directly with an investment management firm is something that will fundamentally change the way we do things?
I do, and as Alan said, I mean, I think this is very rapidly changing. But at the time that we started talking to Wellington and formed our relationship with them, there was a really big disconnect between the climate world and the investment world, and I mean, one thing that's clear, right, is that the climate change is here right now. I mean, we've just had this seemingly never-ending series of different categories of extreme weather events all over the world, and those things are having material impacts right now. And so, the investment world has, I think, really rapidly grasping the idea that these physical risks are a now problem, not a future problem, and those risks need to be properly evaluated and priced. And at some fundamental level, that's what the work that we do is all about.
Let's dig into that one a little bit more if we could, Phil, because Alan also mentioned that the mispricing, the fundamental disconnect between appreciation, understanding, and action in certain sectors. Let's talk about the scale of that disconnect for a moment. I know it's contentious. I know a lot of people will deny it, but as we watch heat waves in the most unexpected of places, as we watch flooding all over the world, Tell me about your scientific perspective on the realities and the impacts that we're seeing already and the amount of response that we're getting.
Well, scientifically, it's actually quite interesting. All the things you mentioned, the wildfires, the extreme heat, the floods, and so forth, these are all the sorts of things that we know will become more frequent with climate change. And when an event like the ones you mentioned, when those events occur, scientists retrospectively analyze, okay, how much more likely did climate change make this event? And so there's no question that climate change is tilting the odds for these kinds of events. But what's interests me as a scientist is some of the recent events that we've experienced have been not just record-breaking, but record-breaking by enormous margins, just off the charts. And that's remarkable. 121 degrees Fahrenheit temperature in Canada, is shocking. And the city of Seattle similarly set a new temperature record by some enormous margin. California last year, where I'm from, it was a bad fire year, but the area burned was more than twice that in any previous year. And that seems to suggest that there may be something fundamental going on that even the scientists don't understand. It suggests, it doesn't prove that these sorts of extreme events are unfolding more rapidly than anticipated.
Alan, in the context of the gaps that Philip is talking about, do you see a similar situation in the financial sector? Do you see a big gap between the response and the preparation of financial companies and business in general to the kind of threats that Phil is talking about there?
Yes, absolutely. And in large degrees, if you were to boil down or distill the argument to a single idea, it is this, that there is no real price signal from markets that can even remotely quantify the magnitude of the problem. So if you think about the nature of investments, there can be opinions of fair value, but the most objective construct in markets are prices. They can be wrong at times, and markets can be wrong at times, but they still represent the best of all of consensus's views of reality at any given point in time. And when you think about the problems associated with climate, sustainability, etc., it is that there is no price to signal the liability associated with these negative externalities. So think about the lack of a price on carbon. Think about the lack of a price on water. Prices are useful because they allow capital to mobilize to address inefficiencies. It creates a vehicle or a signal by which we can organize capital and thus investment to solve problems or to alleviate fundamental pressures or to alleviate areas where you have effectively supply-demand mismatch. And in the absence of these signals, you can get repeated, sustained, effective abuse of your natural felt environment and the resources that go along with it. So Phil has talked a little bit about some of these dynamics.
How can we generate those signals? How can we get a really good handle on what those prices should be? Because the market's not giving us those numbers. And you, as a financial analyst in particular, must be looking at the kind of data that comes from science and wondering how best to put a marker on what it is that you're going to decide on. Do you know what I mean? And this, in a way, this is a question for both of you, in the sense, because from Phil's perspective too, how do you put out information that Alan can use? Because usually in science, you give a range of potential outcomes. You don't give specific predictions. So, for both of you, how does one utilize climate data, climate science in a financial decision-making process? Alan, you go first.
Sure. I'll simply state that we have found significant value in Phil and his team's research in identifying where there are climate-driven pressures that are effectively building, where we know there needs to be some form of remediation for that manifests itself in some amount of eventual investment. So you take, for example, what Phil's comments have been about what's happening in the Western Hemisphere. The snowpack levels basically reached 0% in California as of June 1st. The hydroelectricity that's being produced is something like 70% below normal. And this is at a time when you're running your AC more than ever because it's become hotter. And so we recognize that these types of climate-related fundamental pressures can lead to eventual investments, whether near term in the form of backup generation type assets or long term in terms of finding substitutes for power that may not rely on hydroelectric and or ways to make climate more resilient or to make natural forestry or wildlife management much more effective. So that's how we use their research.
Bridging the divide, if you will, between the research world and what we call the real world, the world of decision making, the world of policy making, it is a challenge, and it's one that fascinates me, frankly, and it's one that I've tried to spend most of my life working on. And the reason it's difficult is there's no simple recipe for how to do it. And in the end, what always ends up happening, and I've been doing this for decades, is it takes a sustained engagement. It takes a sustained engagement between the scientific community, the research community, and the decision maker. And what has to happen is each party has to understand enough about what the other party does and how they do it so that they can communicate effectively. And so, for example, when I worked with, you mentioned water resources in the Western U.S., Alan. I worked for a long time with water resource managers in California, and I greatly enjoyed doing that because it required me to understand, okay, what are the issues they face? What are the risks that they face? What is the drought that will break their system? And then I, with some understanding, some minimal understanding of the decisions that need to be made, we as scientists can go back and produce information which is properly tailored to help make those decisions. And it's fun, but it takes work, and I don't know any way to short circuit it or shortcut it.
Gents, I want to get on to questions of specifically how we can make the money meet the mission and the kind of actions we're taking in real time to make a difference. But just before that, Phil, can I just ask, I mean, both of you have mentioned specific elements of climate activity that we have seen that are a cause for concern. But can we focus a bit more firmly on Asia for a second, Phil? I mean, give us a sense of what the threats are in Asia that we could be preparing for from a financial perspective. What does your mapping tell you about the trajectories in this part of the world?
Yeah, sure. And I'll mention that Woodwell Climate Research Center has contributed to some work done by McKinsey and Company specifically on climate impacts and risks in Asia. And McKinsey released a report on this in November of 2020. And our role in Woodwell was to model the physical risks, and the folks at McKinsey translated, if you will, those physical risks into socioeconomic consequences. But to answer your question, I mean, some of the key risks, and obviously Asia is a big place, and so one thing is obviously the risks are different in different locations. But some of the key risks, particularly in South Asia, Southeast Asia, heat and humidity, I mean, are really significant risks. And obviously, those two sub-regions I just named are already hot and humid, but we project rapid increases in heat and humidity. And one of the impacts of that is simply outdoor labor, the ability to work outdoors. And in those regions, in fact, are dependent, their economies are strongly dependent on outdoor labor. And we project, losses in labor output because of extreme heat and humidity, and even lethal heat waves, by which I mean conditions where it's simply not safe to merely sit outdoors in the shade. It can get that hot, and we project that it will get that hot.
Are there more specific areas that you have predicted as being particularly vulnerable?
To heat and humidity, I mean, South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and again, this is detailed a bit in the work done by us with McKinsey. So heat and humidity is one risk. River flooding is a significant and rapidly increasing risk. In some regions, typhoons, tropical cyclones, hurricanes, are a significant risk. Storm surge and flooding associated with those. Obviously, those are risks in coastal regions. And another risk is in Asia is grain yields, and that is we find that with climate change we project increases in year-to-year volatility in grain yields, not necessarily systematic reductions, but year-to-year volatility. And volatility in yields is not great. It just makes things more unpredictable. And the other thing I would mention is Australia is somewhat different from other parts of South Asia, but obviously in Australia we've seen terrible wildfires, and that's not a coincidence. That's not a one-off. I mean, we project really enormous increases in wildfire risk and drought risk, and unfortunately, those tend to occur within Australia in heavily populated regions, particularly in the south and southeast.
All right. Well, let's take those concerns and those warnings, Alan, and translate them into some kind of activity. How do you use that information to create an investment thesis? Talk us a little bit through your process and how you act on this stuff.
Yeah, sure. So I think that adding on a little bit to what Phil has said, if you even think about some of the water shortages in Taiwan that have contributed in part to the inability to produce sufficient semiconductors by TSMC for the rest of the global economy, it has impacted multiple sectors. If you think about air quality or air pollution in areas or over areas or originating in countries like China or India, and how that can permeate quality of life for people in the surrounding areas. All of these types of examples, Taimur, can lead you to what are the types of products or services or technology that may be required to remediate some of this. So it has led us, not just in our strategies, but as a firm, to contemplate more seriously as a almost strategic type view. How do we think about agriculture technology, the type of agriculture technology that can improve crop resilience or crop yields? How do we think about the need for air conditioning or HVAC technology as the world is getting potentially more indoors to offset or to avoid some of the heat and or to help cool? How do we think about water infrastructure and water technology, because shortage seems to be a problem that's getting more acute virtually everywhere? So being able to pair or marry a lot of the insights from Phil's team at Woodwell with how might this impact investment portfolios is what we're attempting. And the important thing is that what used to be viewed as one-offs is becoming effectively repeatable. So you could tell yourself 10 years ago, it's just one wildfire season, it's not going to reoccur. And then you start seeing them happen year after year and in different places, not just California anymore, but in Australia, now in Canada, Western Canada. You begin to recognize that this is a repeating pattern that is going to require sustained investment and sustained way to curate your portfolios.
But you've identified specific verticals, haven't you, as to where you think the impact is most going to be felt?
Yes. Yes.
Tell me about those.
Precisely. Yeah. So, and I would say very broadly, we think about the investment opportunity as climate mitigation and then climate adaptation. So there's a longer term problem around helping to decarbonize, to lower the carbon intensity of economic growth. And that's broadly speaking what we think about when we think about mitigation of climate risk. But then there's climate adaptation. And this is a nod to the reality that there is some amount of climate risk that has been introduced into the physical world that is effectively inescapable at this point. Or it's a nod to the reality that no matter how much you spend on mitigation, you may not be able to reverse sufficiently over time. And so you need to have ways to develop resilience, whether it's in mitigating flood risk or water scarcity or air pollution, et cetera, that over time can make quality of life better or help the global economy to navigate changes in the physical environment.
That's a really important point, and anticipating risks and taking steps pre-disaster to mitigate risk is really, really important. And right now we're not doing that very effectively.
But to what extent though, Phil? I mean, you know, the scale and the intensity of the events that you've been talking about. I mean, you really have been pushing home the idea that we haven't paid enough attention to how great the threat is. To what extent then is mitigation and resilience activity the answer? Is it, I mean, here in Singapore, as you know, we've been raising the road levels to try and compensate for the potential rise in sea levels. But ultimately, is it going to get bad enough such that no amount of mitigation is going to be enough, or that the amount that it's going to cost to put in those measures of mitigation and resilience is going to be even more than we can afford?
No, that's correct, and that in some locations that's correct. And I can give you this example, right? So, New Orleans, 2005 Hurricane Katrina, massive flooding. Now that well, we know that actually, in fact, climate change plays a role in intensifying hurricanes. Okay, so in response to that event, $14 billion was spent on upgrading levees for the city of New Orleans. Now that amount, $14 billion, translates to $35,000 for every citizen in New Orleans. Now, our research at Woodwell shows that the new levees would now be overtopped, or one of them, the major ones anyway, would be overtopped by a 1 in 100 year event, which is not a high level of protection. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers actually disputes that, although they agree that what I just said will be true next year. So effectively, $14 billion has been spent, and that bought 15 or 16 years, arguably. Is that a cost-effective investment?
I think the answer is fairly evident, really, isn't it? But I mean, so Alan, from your perspective, I guess you have two investment opportunities here. One is to invest in the kind of infrastructure companies that are making those resilience measures. But if they're only going to be short-term, then what about the longer-term prospects? What does one invest in, given the realities that Phil has described?
Well, I think that the idea would be that we are becoming more realistic about the problem and the magnitude of climate resilience and climate risk. And so I think that the idea would be that as the climate research and the climate science community is better able to engage with policymakers, that the kinds of investments that we should see going forward are capturing this idea that you can't just solve for something that is a little bit more tactical. And as a result, the type of investment that maybe you would have seen in the aftermath of a Katrina over a decade and a half ago would today be something that is more ambitious, is attempting to solve for many more years, many more sort of standard deviations of risk, is the way that I would think about it. So you're still going to need things like flood management systems. You're still going to need things like hurricane resilience, whether it's in your housing materials, your building materials, your construction materials. But the degree to which it is being used to fortify physical assets, etc., presumptively will be higher and greater over time. So I don't view those types of investments around adaptation as themselves being short-term in nature. It just gets to the idea that these problems are significant, that they're getting worse, and that you have to think much more comprehensively about how much you wish to address them. It very well may be the case that over time you begin to view certain locations as being so at risk that no amount of capital spent to create resilience is necessarily better used than simply thinking about a path toward some type of migration. And I'm not suggesting that you're going to see this unfold in the immediate term, but I think in the intermediate horizon, that is not unrealistic. And so this is going to, we hope, kick off a broader dialogue
when you
around
say that's not...
Go ahead.
What is not unrealistic? The migration of people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's not unrealistic to say that at some point you decide this location is so at risk that whatever we spend to make it more resilient is not better than spending capital to migrate, to go to a different location. I don't think that that's unrealistic, even if it's uncomfortable to contemplate that possibility.
It is uncomfortable to contemplate. It is happening. I mean, I use the example of New Orleans. I mean, the population of New Orleans now is less now still than pre-Katrina.
Right.
The other place where climate-induced migration is happening, or in a very, very unsatisfactory manner, is Alaska, actually. And and in the Arctic generally, but from the perspective of the U.S., it's happening in Alaska, where villages are, especially coastal villages, are susceptible to just erosion, permafrost thaw, and are facing the need to simply relocate. And the government isn't set up to help them do that, and it's not working well at all. I'll add another point, and that which, despite the example of New Orleans, which I just gave, and the comments you made, Alan, I mean, it is true that in many cases, well-designed adaptation spending up front is very cost-effective, and I think that's an overriding point, that investing money pre-disaster can save multiples of that amount of money in terms of post-disaster spending.
But look, gents, I mean, we're talking about rearguard action here. We're talking about fighting what we assume and already see to be happening. But what about prevention, Alan? Are you investing in anything? Are there positive investments that you can make? Are you investing in solar capacity, battery technology, wind capacity,
yes,
all these kind of things to try and perhaps lessen the potential climate change?
Yes, absolutely. And we would categorize those as climate mitigation investments. So there are a number of ways to both decarbonize the supply side of energy. So electricity, moving from coal to solar and wind, your transport, moving from gasoline to battery-powered electric. Those are ways of decarbonizing supply. There's also ways of improving the efficiency of demand. So can you get the same amount of, let's say, lighting, illumination, but use fewer kilowatt hours to produce the same amount? Technology and improved products are all helping in this regard. One of the problems, though, and I'm sure Phil can speak to this, is that you oftentimes may not recognize some of the risks associated with climate until it is really staring you in the face. I would say that Phil's team, their research, has probably identified for many, many years the building risk of wildfire crisis that you're now seeing, that now people fully understand. But it's almost the problem that until people see it happen and it's really right in your face, it becomes difficult to make the types of investments, because before the problem gets horrible, it almost feels like, again, not our view, but the problem with these types of issues is that it almost feels like an unnecessary type of tax or expenditure to devote billions and billions and billions of capital to solve a problem that isn't obvious. And so one of the problems we have is we wait for things to become obvious before we sufficiently attempt to address them. And I think that's really the problem that we're going to see going forward. And that's why we find their research to be so useful in incorporating it into our investment processes.
Phil, you're not an investment guy, you're a scientist, but from your perspective as a scientist, are there specific things you think the investment community should be doing right now? Where would you prioritize the activity? And not just firms like Alan's, but impact investors. We're seeing that area of social impact investment growing and growing. What do you think the focus should be on?
I would say this, for decarbonization, right? And this is what we need to do. We need to decarbonize the global economy. There are a lot of things we already know how to do, which we're not doing. I mean, the electricity sector could be relatively easily decarbonized with technologies that we have now. And anything that would facilitate that would drive that forward would be useful. But the other thing is there are still unsolved challenges in terms of decarbonization. There are sectors that, how do we decarbonize aviation, heavy industry, for example, shipping? There are some really interesting technological challenges that need to be solved. And to the extent that the investment industry can help make capital available to address those challenges, I mean, that's extraordinarily useful.
But not just at this big picture 30,000 foot level, Phil. What about a grassroots level? I mean, AVPN is a philanthropic organization. There are many micro, non-global activities that are going on. I mean, what are the areas, do you think, given the social changes and the demographic changes that you've touched upon already, where should the attention be from the financial areas that are not, as I say, massive global enterprises, but much more grassroots?
To me, what's been powerful in the work that we've done so far, not just with Wellington, but with other folks in the private sector, is just start looking at the physical risks. And what's been powerful about that is just it opens people's eyes to what's at stake, and that is a very, not only provides information on how to prepare, but it's mainly, I think, a very, very powerful motivator of when people really see what's at stake, when they look, that can be transformative in terms of attitudes. And I don't know, maybe you would agree or not agree with this, Alan, but my impression is that folks at Wellington, in the course of the last several years of really digging into these risks, have become more and more impressed at just how much really is at stake.
Absolutely. I think that, and I'm generalizing a little bit, but I think that the broader investment community, and this may be true to some degree at Wellington many, many years ago, would have eyed a lot of this research angle a little bit more cynically. But the reality is what has happened has brought to bear or made obvious how insightful taking this perspective is. Many, many years ago, you didn't have the pervasive wildfire problem in California. You didn't have abnormally low water levels surrounding Taiwan. You didn't have the bushfires in Australia. You're now starting to see repeated episodes, which has turned, I think, broader, perhaps skepticism in the investment community to one where, at the very least, there is an open-mindedness that these issues really do matter.
One thing that's important to me, which we're starting to do in our work with you, but there's so much more to be done, is to look at what you might call the second order effects or the ripple effects of those risks. I mean, it's easy to focus on, okay, wildfire risk, this is the value, real estate's at stake, this is at risk, and so on and so forth. But that's one level of analysis, but the other level of analysis, which actually interests me a lot, is what are the broader societal ramifications? I mean, for California, what are the ramifications of wildfire risk, smoke, power outages, and I think we're starting to see that combined with the ability for people to work remotely. Well, I know, in fact, we're starting to see, out migration from California of the wealthy, of highly educated people, and we've never seen that before. It's historically been the opposite. Wealthy, educated people converge on California. Now that flow is starting to reverse. And what are the ramifications of that? I think it's just incredibly profound, and that's just one example. But that sort of thing is going to start happening all over.
Alan, let me just finish off with a couple of questions for you, if I could. From the action perspective. Here in Asia, we are seeing an awful lot of activity. We're seeing companies like yours, we're seeing impact investors, we're seeing philanthropic investors trying to address the issue, albeit only just getting into gear. But there's still a massive shortfall here in Asia of funds that we have already identified as necessary to do the work. How can we begin to better mobilize the capital to do this stuff? What kind of advice do you have for others in the financial field as to what they can do?
I think it really does begin by expanding your research process. I think for us, if I were to go back and audit the steps that we have taken to get here, one would be to seek broader sources of research, the partnership with Woodwell, incorporating the climate research and the climate science. That happened before it became obvious. We had a collaboration, an informal one, before you started seeing this series of, for example, wildfires and a lot of these other episodes that we've discussed today. So that is, I think, almost step one. The second thing would be to begin to think very broadly about the physical attributes or the physical dependencies of your companies. I don't think people would have thought a year ago that actually TSMC, the world's largest semiconductor company, actually needs plentiful water in Taiwan. What happens if you have a the lowest level in 100 years of water availability around the island of Taiwan, how does that impact your business? So thinking about that, if you are a business that is energy intensive or process intensive, think about what it means if you were to run through some assumed carbon price or carbon tax through the P&L of a business. How might that affect fair value? So being able to think broader, more expansively, and incorporating other viewpoints, I think is what has helped Wellington to get to the point where we are today. And I'm not suggesting that we have it all figured out. There's still much more to go. But I think that to me is sort of steps 1 through 3.
And just a quick follow-up on that. The regulatory landscape is changing, and is like the pace of change there is likely to accelerate into the future. So I guess from your perspective, that has a couple of impacts. One is that you're going to have to deal with a very uncertain environment when it comes to regulatory action on the financial side. But also the other is you must also want to encourage regulatory action. Yep. How do you think we should engage with regulators, and what should be the next step?
Right. I think that regulation and policy and incentives are all a part of this mix of carrots and sticks, as we like to think about it, in terms of encouraging the right types of outcomes. And carrots are incentives, things like subsidies. Sticks are things like regulation or policy. I think what we want to do is encourage the types of outcomes that we think are the most effectively capital efficient. And that includes having a view to negative externalities that have been generated. So being able to work with, in some cases, regulators. We engaged with many of them during the California wildfire situation, as an example, to just describe, and again, with the acknowledgement that these are very thorny problems, that there are many multiple perspectives that have to be brought to bear, but being able to work with regulators to just recognize where are the real pain points, how do you go about addressing them or solving for them in a capital efficient way, which we think, if you include these negative externalities, we think over time can lead to good outcomes or better outcomes.
And Phil, a final question to you on that issue too. I mean, on your website, it says specifically that your company sees a clear need for a standardized and transparent climate risk disclosure framework. So just give me a word on what do you think that framework should look like, and how likely do you think the regulators are to actually impose one?
Oh, I'm optimistic that they will, but what we have in mind there is just very, very simple. Firstly, that risk need to be disclosed, and it's only helpful if that's done in a way that's standardized across companies, right? So the investors can compare the risk of company A to company B to company C. But we also feel that it should be done in a way that's transparent, that the methods should be made public, should be available so that one can assess the quality of the disclosure. And I do frankly have a concern that without that there will be a race to the bottom in terms of quality of disclosures, that the process of doing the disclosure and the assessment and the disclosure will become commoditized, and quality will suffer.
Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you. Thank you so much for providing your insight and wisdom. And to your final point, Alan, I really also do hope that we'll see more financial firms beginning to consult with scientific firms in order to guide their activities and help us through all of this. But once again, thank you both for being on this episode of Money Meets Mission.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.